Hi, I'm Zara Delacroix, and 3 months ago, I walked into my own engagement party wearing a thrift store dress that my mother called appropriate for someone of your status, while my sister glittered in designer couture worth more than most people's cars. That night, I discovered my family had been living a lie that cost me everything I never knew I had: my grandmother's fashion empire, my inheritance, my identity. All stolen while they dressed me like their shameful secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But that humiliation in front of 85 witnesses wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs falling apart. What happened next changed everything. And I mean everything. The family that treated me like their servant discovered they'd been playing dress-up with money that was never theirs to begin with. The Crystal Pavilion at Montecito Resort was the kind of place where wealthy families go to show off their perfect lives. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling, casting prismatic light across marble floors that probably cost more than most people earn in a year. The ocean view through floor-to-ceiling windows was breathtaking, the kind of backdrop that made every photograph look like it belonged in a luxury magazine. This was my engagement party, supposedly celebrating my upcoming marriage to Harrison Blackwell, but standing there in my discount dress, I felt like an intruder at my own event. 85 guests mingled around me, their laughter floating through the air like expensive perfume. Women draped in silk and diamonds moved gracefully between conversations, their designer heels clicking rhythmically against the polished stone. Men in tailored suits discussed business deals and vacation homes with the casual confidence of people who'd never questioned where their next meal would come from. And there I was, Zara Delacroix, the bride-to-be, wearing a navy blue dress from a consignment shop that my mother had selected because it looked humble enough for someone in your position. My position. That phrase had followed me my entire life, like a shadow I couldn't escape. My mother, Celeste Delacroix, had reminded me of my position every day since I could walk. Not quite family, not quite servant, but somewhere in that uncomfortable space between the two. My father, Vincent, treated me like a disappointing investment that had never paid dividends. And my older sister Bianca, she wore her status as the golden daughter like a crown, making sure everyone knew exactly where I ranked in the family hierarchy. Tonight, Bianca looked stunning in a cream-colored Valentino gown that hugged her figure perfectly, each bead sewn by hand, each fold falling exactly where it should. Her jewelry caught the light with every gesture, diamonds that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in my entire life. She moved through the crowd like she owned the space, accepting compliments and air kisses from guests who seemed genuinely delighted to see her. Meanwhile, I hovered near the edge of the room, clutching a glass of champagne I couldn't afford to spill on my one decent dress. Harrison found me there, looking handsome in his custom tuxedo, his smile bright but somehow disconnected from his eyes. We'd been together for 2 years, and he was everything my parents thought I should want. Stable job in finance, old money family connections, and most importantly, he didn't ask questions about why my own family treated me like their charity case. He slipped his arm around my waist, pulling me closer as his college friends approached us with their wives. All perfectly polished couples who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. Zara's family owns Delacroix properties, Harrison explained to his friend Marcus, gesturing vaguely toward where my parents stood holding court near the bar. Quite the real estate empire they've built. Marcus nodded approvingly, but I noticed how his wife's eyes swept over my dress with barely concealed confusion. These people expected the daughter of a successful real estate family to look the part, and I clearly didn't meet their standards. The conversation drifted to wedding plans, honeymoon destinations, and career aspirations. Harrison's friends talked about their wives, involvement in charity galas and art exhibitions, the kind of social activities that required both connections and considerable disposable income. When they asked about my interests, I mentioned my graphic design work, the small freelance projects I took on to pay for things like tonight's dress. The response was polite but dismissive, the kind of smile people give when they're trying to change the subject without seeming rude. My mother appeared beside us like a storm cloud in designer clothing, her silver hair swept into an elegant updo that had probably required 2 hours with a professional stylist. She wore a black cocktail dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, paired with the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother Francesca. The necklace I'd asked about once as a child, only to be told that such beautiful things weren't meant for girls who couldn't appreciate their value. "Harrison, darling," she said, her voice warm with the kind of affection she'd never shown me. "Your parents were just asking about the wedding timeline. Have you two settled on a date?" Her tone suggested that this was a conversation I shouldn't be part of, despite being the bride in question. Harrison launched into details about venue availability and seasonal considerations, while my mother nodded thoughtfully, occasionally glancing at me like I was a problem that needed solving. "We're thinking spring," Harrison said, squeezing my hand in what I assumed was meant to be a reassuring gesture. "Zara's been handling most of the planning, haven't you, sweetheart?" All eyes turned to me, and I felt the familiar heat of being put on the spot without preparation. The truth was, every venue I'd suggested had been deemed either too expensive or inappropriate by my parents, who insisted they needed to approve all wedding decisions, since they'd be contributing to the costs. "We're still exploring options," I said carefully, knowing that anything more specific would lead to questions I couldn't answer honestly. How could I explain that my family's contributions came with strings attached, that every suggestion I made was met with lectures about being realistic and understanding my limitations? My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a warning sign I'd learned to recognize over the years. The evening continued in the same uncomfortable pattern. I stood beside Harrison, smiling and nodding while conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. His friends discussed their weekend homes in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard. Their wives compared notes on personal shoppers and upcoming European vacations. My family mingled effortlessly with this crowd, my father sharing investment strategies with other successful businessmen, while my mother collected compliments on her impeccable taste in everything from venue selection to floral arrangements. Bianca held her own court near the windows, surrounded by admirers who hung on her every word as she described her recent trip to Milan Fashion Week. She wore her experiences like accessories, each story carefully chosen to highlight her sophistication and worldliness. When someone mentioned how fortunate she was to have such opportunities, she glanced in my direction with a smile that looked sympathetic but felt calculating. "Some of us are just naturally drawn to beautiful things," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear. "Others prefer simpler pleasures." The comment was delivered with the kind of practiced cruelty that could be dismissed as innocent observation if challenged, but the message was clear. Even at my own engagement party, she needed everyone to know exactly where we each stood in the family pecking order. Dinner was announced, and the crowd moved toward elegantly appointed tables that had been arranged to maximize both the ocean view and opportunities for networking. I found myself seated at what was obviously the family table, surrounded by relatives who made polite conversation while carefully avoiding any topics that might acknowledge my existence as more than a decorative addition to the evening. My great-aunt Margaret asked Harrison about his investment portfolio. My Uncle Charles discussed real estate trends with my father. My cousin Patricia complimented my mother's choice of flowers, while pointedly ignoring the woman who was supposedly the guest of honor. The meal itself was exquisite, course after course of carefully prepared dishes that probably cost more per plate than I typically spent on groceries in a month. I ate carefully, aware that every gesture was being observed and judged by people who seemed to be waiting for me to prove their low expectations correct. The irony wasn't lost on me that at my own engagement party I felt like I was auditioning for a role I'd already supposedly won. As dinner wound down and guests began moving back toward the bar and dance floor, my mother stood to make a toast. The room quieted as servers distributed fresh glasses of champagne, the crystal catching the light like tiny stars scattered across white tablecloths.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My mother held her glass with the natural grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, her smile radiating the kind of confidence that came from never doubting her place in the world. "Tonight we celebrate not just an engagement but the joining of two wonderful families," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Harrison, we're delighted to welcome you into our family. You're getting a loyal, hardworking young woman who understands the value of commitment and compromise." The words sounded complimentary, but I caught the subtle emphasis on compromise, the gentle reminder that marriage would require me to continue accepting whatever role was assigned to me. Zara has always been our practical daughter, she continued, and I felt my stomach clench at the familiar designation. Practical. It was the word my family used when they wanted to make my limitations sound like virtues, when they needed to explain why I didn't share in the same opportunities as Bianca. She knows how to make the most of what she has, and we're confident she'll bring that same sensibility to her marriage. The guests applauded politely, raising their glasses in acknowledgement of this backhanded tribute to my character. Harrison squeezed my hand again, probably thinking he was being supportive, but I could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, assessing whether this match made sense. Looking around at these faces, I realized that most of them were probably wondering the same thing I'd been asking myself for months. What was Harrison Blackwell, with his family connections and promising career, doing with someone like me? My father stood next, his presence commanding immediate attention even though he'd had several drinks over the course of the evening. Vincent Delacroix was the kind of man who'd built his success through determination and calculated risks, and he expected the same focus from everyone around him. His toast was brief but pointed, welcoming Harrison to the family, while making subtle references to the practical benefits this union would bring to everyone involved. Marriage is ultimately about partnership, he said, his eyes meeting mine across the table. Understanding what each person brings to the relationship and making sure those contributions complement each other. Again, the message was clear. Harrison brought status and financial security. I brought gratitude and compliance. It was a business arrangement dressed up in wedding planning and champagne toasts. The dancing began shortly after the speeches concluded, with Harrison leading me onto the floor for what was supposed to be our special moment. The band played something classic and romantic while we swayed together under those beautiful chandeliers, surrounded by guests who watched our every move with the kind of attention usually reserved for theater performances. I tried to lose myself in the music, to pretend this was the magical evening every bride dreams about, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was playing a role in someone else's story. Other couples joined us gradually, filling the dance floor with elegant movement and quiet conversation. I watched Bianca dancing with her latest boyfriend, a tech executive who looked at her like she was the most fascinating woman he'd ever encountered. Their relationship was newer than mine with Harrison, but somehow they seemed to fit together effortlessly. Two beautiful people, who understood their value and expected the world to recognize it. As the evening progressed, I noticed small conversations happening at the edges of the party, groups of guests speaking in low voices while glancing occasionally in my direction. I told myself I was being paranoid, that not every whispered conversation was about me, but the feeling persisted. These were people who moved in the same social circles, who knew each other's histories and family backgrounds. They'd probably been trying to figure out my story since the invitations were sent. Harrison's mother, Patricia Blackwell, approached me during a break between songs, her smile warm but her eyes calculating in the way of women who'd spent decades navigating high society politics. She was elegantly dressed in navy silk, her jewelry tasteful but expensive, everything about her appearance suggesting old money refinement. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of cultured accent that came from the best schools and careful elocution lessons. "Zara, dear, you look lovely tonight," she said, though her gaze swept over my dress with the quick assessment of someone who knew exactly how much everything cost. "I hope you're enjoying your party. Harrison seems quite taken with you." The comment felt like a question wrapped in polite observation, an invitation to explain myself, or perhaps reveal whatever secrets she suspected I was hiding. "It's been wonderful," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. "Everyone's been so welcoming." She nodded thoughtfully, her attention shifting briefly to where my parents stood laughing with other guests, before returning to my face with renewed interest. "You know, I was just speaking with your mother about wedding planning," she continued, her tone conversational but purposeful. "She mentioned that you're taking a very hands-on approach to managing costs." "How practical of you." There was that word again, practical, but this time it sounded more like a diplomatic way of acknowledging that money was an issue without saying so directly. The conversation continued for several more minutes, Patricia asking careful questions about my background, my work, my plans for the future. Each inquiry felt like a gentle probe, an attempt to understand how someone from my circumstances had ended up engaged to her son. I answered as honestly as I could without revealing the full extent of my family's treatment, but I could see the wheels turning behind her polite smile. She was trying to solve the puzzle of why Harrison had chosen me when he could have had anyone. As midnight approached, guests began making their departures, offering congratulations and promises to see us soon at various upcoming social events. The evening was winding down, but I felt more exhausted than celebratory, drained by hours of pretending to be someone I wasn't sure I could ever become. Harrison walked some of his friends to their cars while I began helping the staff clear tables, a gesture that earned disapproving looks from my mother. "Zara, dear, let the staff handle that," she said, her voice sharp with embarrassment. "You're the guest of honor, not the help." But I'd spent so many years being treated like the help that the distinction felt meaningless. At least cleaning tables gave me something productive to do with my hands, while my mind tried to process everything that had happened. Bianca appeared beside me as I folded napkins, her dress still perfect, despite hours of socializing and dancing. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from never questioning whether she belonged in any room she entered, her presence commanding attention even when she wasn't trying to be noticed. When she spoke, her voice carried the casual cruelty that had defined our relationship since childhood. "You know, Zara, I have to admire your optimism," she said, picking up a champagne flute and examining it like it was an artifact from another civilization. "Most people would find tonight rather overwhelming, but you're handling it beautifully." Of course, Harrison's family is probably wondering what they're getting themselves into, but that's their problem to figure out. The comment hit its mark with surgical precision. She'd identified my deepest insecurity and twisted it into something that sounded almost like praise, a skill she'd perfected over the years. I continued folding napkins, using the repetitive motion to keep my hands steady while my mind raced through all the subtle signs I'd noticed throughout the evening, all the conversations that had stopped when I approached, all the assessing glances from people who clearly had questions about my place in this world. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Bianca's smile widened, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity to share information that would cause maximum damage. "Oh, just that Harrison's mother was asking some very interesting questions about our family finances," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp with malicious pleasure. Apparently, she'd heard some rumors about Delacroix properties and wanted to understand exactly what kind of family her son was marrying into. Mother handled it beautifully, of course, but it must be exhausting to constantly manage expectations about what you can and can't provide. The words settled over me like ice water, confirming suspicions I'd been trying to ignore all evening. Harrison's family had been evaluating not just me, but my entire family's financial situation, probably trying to determine whether this marriage would be an asset or a liability to their social standing. The engagement ring on my finger suddenly felt heavy, less like a symbol of love and more like a contract with terms I didn't fully understand. "I'm sure everything will work out fine," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Bianca nodded sagely, as if she were genuinely concerned about my welfare rather than enjoying my discomfort. "Of course it will," she agreed. "You've always been so good at adapting to whatever situation you find yourself in. It's really quite impressive how you manage to make the best of things, no matter how challenging they become." The praise felt like poison wrapped in silk, designed to sound supportive while reinforcing every insecurity I'd ever had about my place in this family and this world. The last guests finally departed, leaving behind the debris of an evening that had looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow at its core. Harrison kissed me goodbye, promising to call tomorrow to discuss thank you notes and wedding planning next steps. His parents offered polite farewells, their smiles warm but somehow distant, as if they were still processing everything they'd observed and heard throughout the night. My family gathered in the pavilion's main room, surrounded by empty tables and discarded flower arrangements, conducting their post-event analysis with the efficiency of people who'd hosted many such gatherings. My father calculated costs and discussed the evening's networking opportunities with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished important business objectives. My mother reviewed guest reactions and social dynamics, pleased with how she'd managed various conversational challenges throughout the night. "Overall, I think it went very well," she said, removing her jewelry with the careful attention of someone handling valuable assets. Harrison's family seemed pleased, and we managed to address their concerns without making things awkward. The casual reference to concerns made my stomach clench, confirming that there had indeed been issues discussed beyond my hearing. "What concerns?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. My parents exchanged one of their meaningful glances, the kind of silent communication that had excluded me from family discussions my entire life. "Nothing you need to worry about," my father said dismissively. "Just the usual questions wealthy families ask when they're evaluating potential additions to their social circle. We handled everything appropriately." The phrase potential additions made me feel like merchandise being inspected for quality and value, rather than a daughter celebrating her engagement. We rode home in silence, my family each lost in their own thoughts about the evening's successes and challenges. I stared out the window at the passing landscape, expensive houses and manicured neighborhoods that represented the world I was supposed to be joining through marriage. But instead of excitement about my future, I felt a growing sense of unease about the price that future might require. Back at the family estate, I retreated to my room while my parents continued their post-party discussions downstairs. My bedroom had always felt like a refuge, the one space where I could drop the pretense of gratitude and contentment that was expected of me everywhere else. But tonight, even this familiar sanctuary couldn't quiet the questions that had been building throughout the evening. I hung up my consignment store dress carefully, treating it with more respect than it probably deserved, but unable to afford replacing it if anything happened. In the mirror, I looked at the woman who'd spent the evening being evaluated and found wanting by people who were supposed to be celebrating her happiness. My makeup was still perfect, my hair still carefully styled, but my eyes looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. Sitting on my bed, I replayed conversations from the evening, trying to separate genuine concerns from my own insecurities. But the pattern was undeniable. Too many questions about my background. Too many careful assessments of my family's financial situation. Too many subtle references to managing expectations and adapting to circumstances. I wasn't being welcomed into Harrison's world as an equal partner. I was being evaluated as a potential problem that would need to be managed. The engagement ring caught the lamplight as I twisted it around my finger, and for the first time since Harrison had proposed, I found myself wondering what I was really signing up for. Marriage to a man I cared about but didn't fully understand. Acceptance into a social circle that would always see me as an outsider. And a future that seemed to require me to become smaller and more grateful with each passing day. I reached for my phone, thinking I might call Harrison to process some of what had happened, but stopped before dialing his number. What would I say? That his family and friends had spent the evening evaluating my worth and finding it questionable? That my own family had treated my engagement party like a business networking opportunity rather than a celebration of my happiness? That I felt more like a charity case than a bride-to-be? Instead, I set the phone aside and tried to convince myself that these feelings would pass, that every bride probably had moments of doubt and insecurity. But deep down, I knew this wasn't typical pre-wedding anxiety. This was the recognition that I'd spent my entire life accepting whatever role was assigned to me, and I was about to do it again on a much larger scale. The only difference was that this time, the consequences would last a lifetime. The morning after my engagement party arrived, with the kind of California sunshine that made everything look deceptively perfect, I woke up in my childhood bedroom, still wearing the makeup from the night before, my discount dress hanging on the closet door like evidence of my inadequacy. The house was quiet, my parents probably sleeping off the champagne and social exhaustion from hosting what they considered a successful evening. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during those hours at the Crystal Pavilion. I showered and dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, the kind of clothes that made me invisible in my own home. Downstairs, I found my mother in the kitchen, still in her silk robe, sipping coffee from a cup that probably cost more than my entire outfit. She looked up when I entered, her expression neutral but watchful, like she was gauging my mood after the previous night's revelations. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice carrying the careful politeness she used when she wanted to avoid difficult conversations. "I hope you're feeling better today. You seemed a bit overwhelmed last night." The suggestion that I'd been overwhelmed rather than humiliated felt typical of how my family reframed uncomfortable truths, turning my legitimate concerns into evidence of my inability to handle sophisticated social situations. "I'm fine," I replied, though we both knew it wasn't true. I poured myself coffee from the expensive machine that my parents had imported from Italy. one of many luxury items that filled our house while I shopped at thrift stores and clipped coupons. The contrast had never bothered me much before, but after last night's careful evaluations and whispered assessments, everything felt different. My mother studied me over the rim of her cup, her eyes sharp despite the early hour. Celeste Delacroix had built her social standing through careful observation and strategic responses, and she could read people's emotional states like other women read fashion magazines. She knew I was processing something, and she was trying to determine whether it posed a threat to her carefully constructed family narrative. "Harrison called this morning," she said, watching my reaction closely. "He wanted to thank us again for such a lovely evening. His mother also called, actually. She had some very nice things to say about how well everything was organized." The emphasis on organization rather than celebration felt deliberate, another reminder that last night had been more about managing impressions than celebrating my happiness. "What did Mrs. Blackwell say exactly?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the details. My mother's smile became more pronounced, the expression of someone who'd successfully navigated a challenging social situation and wanted credit for her diplomatic skills. "She was very complimentary about our hospitality," my mother said carefully, "and she appreciated how transparent we were about our family's financial situation." Apparently, there had been some confusion about the scope of Delacroix properties, but we were able to clarify everything very diplomatically. The word transparent made my stomach clench, suggesting that my family had revealed more about our circumstances than I'd realized. Before I could ask for more details, my father appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. Vincent Delacroix started every morning at 6:30 sharp, reviewing financial reports and planning his daily objectives with the kind of methodical precision that had built his real estate business from nothing. He nodded at me briefly before focusing his attention on my mother, ready to discuss whatever business items required immediate attention. "The Patterson contract needs final signatures today," he said, pouring coffee into a travel mug that bore the Delacroix Properties logo. "And I want to review the quarterly projections before the board meeting tomorrow." His tone was brisk, efficient, the voice of a man who'd learned to compartmentalize personal and professional concerns. But I noticed how he avoided making eye contact with me, suggesting that last night's social dynamics were still weighing on his mind. "Vincent," my mother said carefully, "Zara was asking about the conversation with Patricia Blackwell. Perhaps you could explain what we discussed regarding the wedding budget." Her voice carried the kind of diplomatic caution that suggested this was a sensitive topic requiring careful handling. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a sign that he was uncomfortable with the direction of this conversation. He'd always preferred dealing with concrete business problems rather than the messy emotional complexities of family relationships. But my mother's expectant silence indicated that this discussion couldn't be postponed indefinitely. "The Blackwells wanted to understand the financial arrangements for the wedding," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "We explained that while Delacroix Properties is successful, we believe in teaching our children the value of living within reasonable means. They seemed to appreciate our approach to fiscal responsibility." The phrase reasonable means felt like a euphemism for limitations I was only beginning to understand. "What kind of financial arrangements?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would confirm my worst fears about last night's undercurrents. My parents exchanged another one of their meaningful glances, the silent communication that had excluded me from important family discussions my entire life. "Nothing you need to worry about," my mother said dismissively. "Just the usual conversations that happen between families when they're planning significant events." The Blackwells wanted to ensure that everyone's expectations were properly aligned. The word aligned suggested negotiations I hadn't been part of, decisions about my future made without my input or consent. I felt the familiar weight of being managed rather than included, treated like a problem to be solved rather than a daughter whose happiness mattered. But this time, instead of accepting their dismissive explanations, I found myself pushing back against the comfortable pattern of exclusion that had defined my entire life. "I think I have a right to know what financial discussions are happening about my own wedding," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "especially if these conversations are affecting how Harrison's family sees me." The directness of my challenge seemed to surprise both parents, who were accustomed to my quiet acceptance of whatever information they chose to share. My father set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, a gesture that usually preceded lectures about respect and family hierarchy. But before he could speak, my mother intervened with the kind of smooth redirection she'd perfected over years of managing social situations. "Of course you have a right to know," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We were simply trying to handle these discussions diplomatically without creating unnecessary stress for you. The Blackwells are naturally curious about our family's financial position, given that Harrison is making such an important commitment." The phrase "important commitment" made my engagement sound like a business merger rather than a romantic relationship. "And what did you tell them about our financial position?" I pressed, sensing that this was the crucial question everyone had been avoiding. My parents' obvious discomfort confirmed that whatever they'd revealed had been significant enough to change the entire dynamic of last night's gathering. "We were honest about the scope of our assets," my father said finally, his voice tight with the kind of controlled frustration he usually reserved for difficult business negotiations. "Delacroix Properties is successful within its market segment, but we're not operating at the level of some other families in Harrison's social circle. We felt it was important to manage expectations appropriately." The word "appropriately" suggested that my family had essentially apologized for not being wealthy enough to deserve equal treatment. The conversation continued for several more minutes, my parents carefully explaining how they'd positioned our family's financial limitations as virtues rather than shortcomings. They'd emphasized our work ethic, our practical approach to money management, and our commitment to building character through modest living. What they'd actually done was confirm every suspicion Harrison's family might have had about my suitability as a long-term partner. As I listened to their diplomatic explanations, I felt something shift inside me, a growing awareness that my entire life had been built on accepting whatever narrative my family chose to construct about my worth and potential. They'd convinced me that being practical was noble, that being grateful for scraps was admirable, that questioning their decisions was selfish and ungrateful. But last night had shown me how this narrative looked from the outside, and the view was deeply unflattering. After my parents left for their respective offices, I found myself alone in the house for the first time in days. The silence felt different now, charged with questions I'd never allowed myself to ask. I wandered through rooms filled with expensive furniture and artwork, evidence of a lifestyle that somehow never extended to my personal circumstances. The contradiction had always been explained away through lectures about character building and financial responsibility, but now it felt more like deliberate exclusion. I ended up in my father's study, a room I'd rarely entered without explicit permission. The space was masculine and imposing, with dark wood furniture and leather-bound books that suggested intellectual authority. Behind his desk hung diplomas and business awards, evidence of professional success that had supposedly benefited our entire family. But looking around this expensive sanctuary, I wondered why that success had never translated into opportunities for me. On a whim, I opened the desk drawers, not really looking for anything specific but driven by a curiosity I'd never allowed myself to indulge. Most contained the usual business documents and office supplies, but the bottom drawer was locked. The sight of that small brass lock sent an unexpected jolt of determination through me, as if my subconscious had been waiting for exactly this kind of barrier to challenge. I searched through the desk accessories until I found a letter opener with a thin enough blade to attempt picking the simple mechanism. It took several minutes of careful maneuvering, but eventually the lock clicked open, revealing a collection of manila folders arranged with the kind of meticulous organization my father applied to everything in his professional life. Most of the folders contained property documents and investment records, the expected paperwork of a successful real estate business. But one folder, labeled simply Francesca Estate, caught my attention immediately. My grandmother Francesca had died when I was 12, and I had only vague memories of an elegant woman who'd always seemed slightly out of place at family gatherings. My parents rarely spoke about her, referring to her death as a sad chapter that was better left closed. I opened the folder with trembling fingers, expecting to find routine estate documents or perhaps some sentimental items my father had saved. Instead, I discovered a collection of legal papers that made absolutely no sense given everything I'd been told about my grandmother's circumstances. Francesca Delacroix hadn't been the financially modest widow my parents had described. According to these documents, she'd been the primary shareholder in something called Belmont Couture Empire, a fashion house that appeared to have substantial international holdings. The papers were technical and filled with legal terminology I didn't fully understand, but certain details were impossible to miss. My grandmother had owned fashion design companies in Paris, Milan, and New York. She'd held patents on numerous clothing designs and manufacturing processes. Most importantly, according to a document dated just 3 months before her death, she'd established a trust fund that would transfer ownership of these assets to her eldest granddaughter on her 25th birthday. I was 25, and I was her eldest granddaughter. My hands shook as I read through page after page of financial records and legal documents that painted a picture completely at odds with everything my family had told me about our history. Francesca hadn't died in modest circumstances, leaving behind only sentimental items and minor debts. She died as the owner of a fashion empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, an empire that should have been mine 3 months ago. The implications hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been shopping at thrift stores and accepting my family's lectures about financial responsibility, I'd been the rightful owner of companies that employed thousands of people and generated enormous profits every year. While I'd been grateful for the opportunity to live in my parents' house and eat their food, I'd actually been subsidizing their lifestyle with money that belonged to me. I kept reading, trying to understand how this massive deception had been possible. The answer lay in the final section of documents, which detailed the legal maneuvering my father had undertaken immediately after my grandmother's death. Through a series of shell companies and trust modifications, he'd managed to redirect the ownership of Belmont Couture Empire away from me and toward entities he controlled. The process had been complex and probably expensive, but it had effectively stolen my inheritance while keeping me completely unaware of what I'd lost. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. My family hadn't just failed to tell me about my inheritance. They'd actively conspired to steal it, using their superior knowledge of legal and financial systems to rob me of assets that could have changed my entire life. Every lecture about being practical, every reminder about my position in the family, every suggestion that I should be grateful for their support, had been delivered while they were literally living off money that belonged to me. I photographed every document with my phone, my anger growing with each page of evidence. The irony was overwhelming. Last night, my family had apologized to the Blackwells for not being wealthy enough to provide appropriate wedding support. This morning, I discovered that I was actually the owner of assets that dwarfed anything Harrison's family could claim. The woman they'd dressed in thrift store clothes and treated like a charity case was actually one of the wealthiest people at her own engagement party. But the most devastating realization was understanding how completely I'd been manipulated. My family hadn't just stolen my money, they'd stolen my identity, convincing me that I was fortunate to receive scraps from a table that should have been entirely mine. They'd shaped my entire sense of self around limitations that didn't actually exist, ensuring that I'd never question the circumstances of my reduced position within our household. I sat in my father's expensive leather chair, surrounded by evidence of his deception, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. Everything I'd believed about my life was a lie. Everything I'd accepted about my family's dynamics was built on fraud. Everything I'd been grateful for was actually stolen from me through sophisticated legal manipulation and systematic emotional abuse. The phone rang, startling me out of my shocked contemplation. The caller ID showed Harrison's name, and I stared at the screen for several rings before deciding whether to answer. How could I explain what I'd just learned? How could I tell my fiancé that the modest circumstances everyone had been so diplomatically managing weren't actually my circumstances at all? "Hello," I said, my voice sounding strangely normal despite the chaos in my mind. "Zara, darling." Harrison's voice was warm and familiar, an anchor of normalcy in a world that had just been completely redefined. "I wanted to call and thank you again for such a wonderful evening. My parents haven't stopped talking about how gracious your family was with all their questions." The word gracious felt loaded with new meaning now that I understood what those questions had really been about. "I'm glad they enjoyed themselves," I managed, though every word felt like it was being spoken by someone else. How could I maintain normal conversation when I just discovered that my entire life was built on lies? Listen, I was hoping we could have lunch today, Harrison continued. My mother suggested we start looking at some venues for the ceremony, and she had some ideas about keeping costs manageable while still creating something beautiful. I thought you might appreciate her practical approach. The word practical felt like a knife twisting in a fresh wound, another reminder of the narrative that had been constructed around my supposed limitations. Actually, Harrison, I think I need some time to process last night, I said carefully. There were some conversations that raised questions for me about how our families see this relationship. It was the most diplomatic way I could think of to acknowledge the growing chasm between my public circumstances and my newly discovered reality. Of course, he said, though I could hear the slight concern in his voice. Wedding planning can be overwhelming, especially when there are a lot of opinions involved. But I want you to know that none of the financial discussions matter to me. I love you regardless of what your family can or can't contribute to the wedding. The reassurance was meant to be comforting, but it felt patronizing now that I knew the truth about my actual financial position. After ending the call, I continued reading through the documents, trying to understand the full scope of what had been taken from me. Belmont Couture Empire wasn't just a successful fashion house. It was a multinational corporation with subsidiaries in luxury goods, retail properties, and manufacturing facilities. My grandmother had built an empire that rivaled anything in the fashion industry, and she'd intended for me to inherit not just her wealth but her legacy of creativity and business innovation. The more I learned about Francesca's accomplishments, the more I understood why my family had worked so hard to erase her from our family narrative. She represented everything they'd convinced me I could never be: successful, independent, financially powerful, and creatively fulfilled. By stealing my inheritance, they hadn't just taken my money. They'd stolen my role model, my inspiration, and my understanding of what was possible for my own life. I spent the rest of the morning researching Belmont Couture Empire online, discovering a company that was currently being run by a board of directors who reported to shell companies controlled by my father. The fashion house continued to thrive, releasing seasonal collections that earned critical acclaim and commercial success. Models wore Belmont designs on red carpets and runways around the world. Celebrities competed for custom pieces from their couture division. All of this success was being built on the foundation my grandmother had created, using systems and resources that should have been mine to control. The website showed images of beautiful clothing that represented exactly the kind of creative work I'd always been drawn to, but never pursued seriously. My family had dismissed my interest in fashion and design as impractical hobbies, steering me toward what they called more realistic career options. Now I understood that their discouragement hadn't been about protecting me from disappointment. It had been about preventing me from developing skills and interests that might lead me to discover my true inheritance. By afternoon, I'd gathered enough evidence to understand the basic structure of my father's deception, but I knew I needed professional help to fully comprehend the legal implications and possible remedies. The documents suggested that my inheritance had been redirected rather than permanently lost, which meant there might be ways to reclaim what had been stolen. But I also knew that my family wouldn't give up these assets without a fight that would require sophisticated legal strategy and considerable resources. The irony was that I had those resources if I could figure out how to access them. Somewhere in the labyrinth of shell companies and trust modifications, I was still the rightful owner of Belmont Couture Empire. But claiming that ownership would require proving that my father's legal maneuvering had been fraudulent, a process that would likely expose our family to criminal prosecution and civil liability. I photographed the last of the documents and carefully returned everything to its original position, making sure the locked drawer appeared undisturbed. My father would be home soon, and I needed time to develop a strategy before confronting him with what I'd discovered. This wasn't the kind of conversation that could happen spontaneously. It required careful planning and professional support. As I prepared to leave his study, I caught sight of myself in the mirror hanging near his desk. The woman looking back at me appeared the same as always, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. This morning I'd been Zara Delacroix, the grateful daughter who accepted whatever circumstances her family provided. Tonight I was someone else entirely, the rightful owner of a fashion empire, who'd been robbed of her inheritance through systematic deception and legal fraud. The transformation felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. For 25 years, I'd defined myself through limitations and modest expectations, never imagining that I could be anything more than what my family had told me I was capable of becoming. But my grandmother's documents had revealed a different possibility, a version of myself that had been stolen along with my financial inheritance. I walked through the house one more time, seeing everything with new eyes. The expensive furniture and artwork that had always made me feel like a grateful guest in my own home had likely been purchased with profits from my fashion empire. The luxury cars in the garage, the designer clothes in my mother's closet, the exclusive country club memberships, and expensive vacations, all of it had been funded by assets that should have been mine to control. But more than the money, I'd been robbed of my identity. My grandmother had been a creative innovator who'd built something extraordinary from nothing. Exactly the kind of woman I'd always dreamed of becoming but never believed I could be. My family had stolen not just her legacy but my connection to her example. They'd convinced me that creativity was impractical, that business success was beyond my capabilities, that I should be satisfied with whatever small role they were willing to assign me. Now I understood that those limitations had never been real. They'd been carefully constructed barriers designed to prevent me from discovering my true potential and rightful place in the world. Every time I'd expressed interest in fashion or design, every time I'd wondered about starting my own business, every time I'd questioned why my circumstances seemed so different from my sister's, I'd been getting close to truths my family couldn't afford to let me discover. As evening approached, I heard my parents returning from their respective offices, their voices carrying through the house as they discussed the day's business developments. They sounded satisfied, successful, completely unaware that their carefully constructed deception had been discovered. Tomorrow, they would continue managing my life and my relationships, making decisions about my future based on the false narrative they'd spent years creating. But tonight, everything had changed. Tonight, I knew who I really was and what had been stolen from me. The question now was what I intended to do with that knowledge. Confronting my family directly would only give them time to cover their tracks and prepare their defenses. I needed allies, legal representation, and a strategy that would allow me to reclaim my inheritance without giving them opportunities to hide or destroy evidence. I thought about Harrison, sleeping peacefully in his apartment, still believing he was engaged to a woman who needed his family's financial support and social connections to create a successful life. How would he react when he learned that his modest fiancée was actually wealthier than his entire family combined? Would he be excited about the possibilities? Or would he feel deceived by the false narrative that had shaped our entire relationship? More importantly, did I want to build a marriage on the foundation of lies my family had constructed? Or did I need to discover who I really was before making commitments about my future? The engagement ring on my finger felt heavy, less like a symbol of love, and more like another chain binding me to a life that had been designed around limitations that didn't actually exist. I made a decision as I sat in my room, surrounded by the evidence of my family's deception. Tomorrow, I would start the process of reclaiming my true identity and my stolen inheritance. I would find lawyers who specialized in trust and estate fraud. I would gather more evidence about the scope of my father's legal maneuvering. I would discover exactly what Francesca Delacroix had built and what it would take to claim my rightful place as her heir. But most importantly, I would stop accepting the narrative that had been constructed around my supposed limitations. I would stop being grateful for scraps from a table that should have been entirely mine. I would stop allowing my family to define my worth and potential based on lies they'd told to justify their theft. The woman who went to sleep that night was not the same person who'd attended her engagement party the evening before. That woman had been a creation of my family's imagination, designed to serve their purposes and accept their control. The woman I was becoming would be much more dangerous to their carefully constructed world, because she knew the truth about what they'd stolen and what she was entitled to reclaim. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that felt almost foreign after years of accepting confusion as normal. The documents I'd photographed were still on my phone, proof that the previous day's discovery hadn't been some elaborate dream born from frustration and engagement party humiliation. I was the rightful owner of Belmont Couture Empire, and my family had spent 13 years stealing from me while convincing me I should be grateful for their scraps. I dressed carefully in one of my few decent outfits, a black blazer and gray pants that I'd bought for job interviews 2 years ago. Today, I needed to look professional, competent, like someone who belonged in lawyers' offices and boardrooms rather than thrift stores and family kitchens. The transformation felt symbolic, shedding the image of modest gratitude that had been carefully cultivated for me, in favor of something sharper and more purposeful. Before leaving the house, I transferred all the photographs to a secure cloud storage account and made multiple backup copies. If my family discovered what I'd learned, these documents might disappear or be destroyed, and I couldn't afford to lose the only proof of their systematic deception. The paranoia felt justified given the sophistication of their fraud, the careful legal maneuvering that had stolen my inheritance while keeping me completely unaware of what I'd lost. My first stop was Luna Cafe, a small coffee shop in downtown Santa Barbara that offered Wi-Fi and relative anonymity. I needed time to research without my family monitoring my internet activity or questioning my sudden interest in estate law and fashion industry finances. The cafe was busy with morning commuters and remote workers, providing perfect cover for someone conducting sensitive research. I ordered a large coffee and found a corner table where I could work without being overheard. Opening my laptop, I began systematic searches for information about Belmont Couture Empire, cross-referencing what I'd learned from my father's documents with publicly available business records and industry publications. What I discovered was both thrilling and devastating. Belmont Couture wasn't just successful, it was legendary. Fashion magazines described it as one of the most innovative and influential houses in the industry, known for designs that balanced artistic vision with commercial appeal. The company's seasonal collections consistently earned critical acclaim, and their custom couture work was sought after by celebrities, socialites, and foreign royalty. Industry analysts estimated the company's total value at over $600 million, making it one of the most valuable privately held fashion businesses in the world. But more than the financial success, I was struck by the creative legacy my grandmother had built. Articles about Francesca Delacroix described her as a visionary who'd revolutionized fashion manufacturing while maintaining the artistic integrity that defined haute couture. She'd developed new textile techniques, pioneered sustainable production methods, and created training programs that had launched the careers of dozens of now famous designers. This wasn't just a business, it was a creative empire built on innovation and excellence. The contrast with my family's version of Francesca was jarring. They described her as a sweet but impractical woman who'd struggled financially and died, leaving behind more sentiment than substance. In reality, she'd been one of the most successful entrepreneurs of her generation, a creative genius who'd built something that would outlast her lifetime. My family hadn't just stolen my money, they'd stolen my connection to an extraordinary role model who could have shaped my understanding of what was possible for my own life. I spent 2 hours reading about Belmont Couture's history, taking notes on key dates, partnerships, and business relationships that might be relevant to understanding my father's theft. The company had continued to thrive under the management of various executives, but according to corporate filings, ultimate ownership remained vested in a complex network of trusts and holding companies. Untangling that network would require legal expertise far beyond my capabilities. Around 10 o'clock, I called the first law firm on my research list, a prestigious Santa Barbara practice that specialized in estate and trust litigation. The receptionist was polite but firm about requiring more specific information before scheduling consultations, particularly for cases involving significant assets and potential fraud allegations. I realized I needed a more strategic approach than simply calling random lawyers and hoping someone would take my case seriously. Instead, I researched individual attorneys who'd handled similar cases, looking for someone with experience in trust fraud, estate theft, and ideally some understanding of family business disputes. After another hour of careful investigation, I found Nadia Ramirez, a partner at Coastal Legal Group, who'd built her reputation representing beneficiaries in complex inheritance disputes. Her track record included several high-profile cases where she'd successfully recovered assets stolen through fraudulent trust modifications. Nadia's office was located in a sleek building overlooking the harbor, the kind of place that suggested both success and discretion. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 30s, asked me to wait in a conference room while she confirmed that Ms. Ramirez was available for an emergency consultation. The room's windows offered a panoramic view of sailboats and expensive yachts, a reminder of the world I should have belonged to if my inheritance hadn't been stolen. When Nadia entered, she brought an energy that immediately put me at ease. She was probably in her early 40s, with intelligent dark eyes, and an attitude that suggested she'd built her career by taking on cases other lawyers might avoid. Her handshake was firm, professional, but not intimidating, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of confidence that came from winning difficult battles. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into the chair across from me with a legal pad and the focused attention of someone accustomed to hearing complicated stories. "And don't worry about whether it sounds believable. I've heard things that would make your situation seem routine." I started with the engagement party, explaining how the evening had revealed uncomfortable truths about my family's financial circumstances and social standing. I described the careful way my parents had managed expectations about wedding costs, the diplomatic conversations about our limited resources, and the growing sense that I was being evaluated rather than celebrated by Harrison's family. Then I told her about discovering the locked drawer in my father's study, the documents that had revealed my grandmother's true legacy, and the sophisticated legal maneuvering that had redirected my inheritance toward shell companies controlled by my father. As I spoke, Nadia took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing me to tell the complete story without interruption. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I worried that my story sounded too fantastic, too much like the kind of family drama that belonged in television shows rather than real life. But when she spoke, her voice carried the excitement of someone who'd just been presented with exactly the kind of challenge she lived for. "This is substantial," she said carefully. "If your documentation proves what you've described, we're looking at systematic trust fraud, estate theft, and possibly criminal conspiracy. The financial damages alone would be enormous, but the emotional and psychological abuse adds layers that could make this case very compelling to both judges and juries." She explained that recovering stolen inheritance typically involved multiple legal strategies, from civil lawsuits seeking financial damages to criminal referrals for fraud prosecution. The process would be complex and potentially lengthy, but the strength of my documentation suggested that success was not only possible but likely. More importantly, the ongoing nature of the theft meant that my father was continuing to commit crimes every day he maintained control of assets that rightfully belonged to me. "The key question," Nadia said, "is whether you're prepared for the consequences of pursuing this case. Your family will fight back, probably viciously. They'll try to discredit you, question your motives, and make you seem ungrateful or mentally unstable. And once this becomes public, your entire social circle will know that your family has been living a lie for over a decade." I thought about Harrison, probably at his office right now, still believing he was engaged to a woman who needed his family's financial support to create a successful life. I thought about my parents, continuing their daily routines while managing the stolen proceeds of my inheritance. I thought about Bianca, wearing designer clothes purchased with money that belonged to me, while treating me like the family's charity case. "They've already taken 13 years of my life," I said finally. "They've stolen my inheritance, my identity, and my understanding of what's possible for my future. I'm not going to let them keep what belongs to me just because fighting back might be uncomfortable." Nadia smiled, the expression of someone who just gained a client she was genuinely excited to represent. We spent the next hour discussing strategy, timelines, and the immediate steps needed to protect my interests while building a comprehensive case. She recommended hiring a private investigator to document the current scope of my father's control over Belmont Couture assets, gathering additional evidence about the fraudulent trust modifications, and identifying witnesses who might support my claims about the family's deceptive behavior. She also suggested that I consider hiring a personal security consultant, at least temporarily. Cases involving significant financial assets sometimes generated threats or intimidation attempts, particularly when the defendants had substantial resources and reputations to protect. The suggestion felt dramatic, but Nadia's matter-of-fact tone indicated that such precautions were routine rather than paranoid. Before leaving her office, I provided copies of all the documents I'd photographed, along with detailed written accounts of every conversation and incident I could remember that supported my claims about my family's systematic deception. Nadia assigned a paralegal to begin organizing this information and scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next day, when she'd have preliminary research completed and could outline specific legal strategies. Walking back to my car, I felt simultaneously empowered and terrified. The legal process would take months, possibly years, and would likely destroy my relationships with everyone I'd known my entire life. But for the first time since discovering the truth about my inheritance, I felt like I was taking action rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond my control. My phone buzzed with a text from Harrison asking about dinner plans, a reminder that my engagement existed in a bubble that was about to be permanently burst. How could I continue planning a wedding built on assumptions about my financial circumstances that were completely false? How could I marry someone who'd fallen in love with a version of me that had been carefully constructed to hide my true identity and potential? I decided to postpone that conversation until I had a clearer understanding of my legal options and timeline. Harrison deserved honesty about what I'd discovered, but he also deserved a coherent explanation rather than the emotional chaos I was currently processing. Tonight, I would focus on gathering more evidence and building my case. Tomorrow, I would start having the difficult conversations that would reshape every relationship in my life. Driving home, I noticed details about my neighborhood that had previously escaped my attention. The houses were large and expensive, the cars were luxury models, and the landscaping was professionally maintained. This was a community of successful people who expected their children to maintain similar standards of living. But unlike my neighbors, my family's lifestyle was funded by stolen assets rather than legitimate business success. The irony was overwhelming. My parents had spent years lecturing me about living within my means, while they were literally living beyond theirs, using my inheritance to maintain a social position they hadn't actually earned. Every time they'd reminded me about being practical and grateful, they'd been protecting their own theft rather than teaching me valuable life lessons. Back at the house, I found my mother in the garden, deadheading roses with the kind of meticulous attention she applied to all aspects of our family's public image. She looked up when I approached, her smile warm but watchful, still gauging my emotional state after the previous night's revelations about wedding finances. "How was your morning, darling?" she asked, setting down her pruning shears to give me her full attention. "I hope you're feeling better about everything. These wedding planning phases can be so overwhelming, but it all works out in the end." Her tone was reassuring, designed to minimize any concerns I might have about the financial discussions that had dominated my engagement party. "Actually, I spent the morning doing some research about our family history," I said carefully, watching her reaction for any signs of nervousness or guilt. "I realized how little I know about grandmother Francesca. I was hoping you could tell me more about her life and what she left behind when she died." The change in my mother's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Her smile became more forced, and her hands moved restlessly among the flowers, betraying an anxiety she was trying to conceal. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality she used when discussing topics she preferred to avoid. "Francesca was a lovely woman, but her life was quite sad, really," she said, not meeting my eyes directly. "She struggled financially after your grandfather died, and she never quite recovered from losing the little dress shop she'd tried to run. By the time she passed away, there wasn't much left except some sentimental items and minor debts we had to settle." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I might have believed it if I hadn't seen the documents proving otherwise. My mother had clearly rehearsed this version of family history, creating a narrative that explained away any questions about inheritance or missing assets. But knowing the truth made her deception feel like another violation, proof that every conversation we'd ever had about family history had been carefully scripted to hide reality. "That's interesting," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I was reading about the fashion industry this morning, and I came across some articles about successful designers from that era. I wondered if grandmother might have known any of them." The question was designed to test whether my mother would provide any truthful information if given the opportunity. "Oh, I doubt it," she replied quickly, too quickly. "Francesca's little shop was very modest. Nothing like the big fashion houses. She mostly did alterations and simple dressmaking for local customers. Nothing glamorous or particularly successful." Again, the ease with which she dismissed my grandmother's actual accomplishments suggested that this conversation had happened many times before, probably whenever I'd shown interest in family history or expressed curiosity about inheritance. I excused myself before my growing anger could show in my voice or expression. Confronting my mother now would only alert my family to what I discovered, giving them time to hide evidence or prepare defenses. Instead, I needed to continue gathering information while maintaining the appearance of normalcy, at least until Nadia had developed a comprehensive legal strategy. In my room, I called Fletcher Kane, the private investigator Nadia had recommended. His voice was gravelly but reassuring, with the kind of professional competence that suggested he'd handled similar cases involving family deception and hidden assets. When I explained what I needed, he didn't seem surprised by the complexity of the situation or the scope of the investigation required. "Trust me, I've seen worse," he said when I finished describing my family's theft. Rich families get very creative when they want to hide assets or cheat beneficiaries. But they also get sloppy over time, especially when they think they've gotten away with it. 13 years is a long time to maintain a complex fraud without leaving evidence trails. Fletcher explained that his investigation would focus on documenting the current structure of Belmont Couture's ownership, identifying all the shell companies and trust modifications my father had used to redirect my inheritance, and gathering evidence about the ongoing financial benefits my family received from their theft. The process would take several weeks, but would provide the comprehensive documentation needed to support criminal charges and civil recovery actions. He also recommended that I be careful about my communications and daily routines, suggesting that my family might become suspicious if they noticed significant changes in my behavior or activities. The investigation needed to proceed quietly, until we had enough evidence to prevent any attempts at hiding or destroying incriminating documents. After ending the call, I spent the rest of the afternoon researching Belmont Couture's current operations, learning about the company my grandmother had built and I should have inherited. The fashion house maintained showrooms in New York, Paris, and Milan, employed over 2,000 people worldwide, and generated annual revenues exceeding $400 million. This wasn't just money that had been stolen from me. It was a creative empire that represented exactly the kind of career I'd always dreamed of, but never believed I could achieve. The most painful discovery was learning about Belmont Couture's internship and mentorship programs, initiatives my grandmother had established to support young designers and business students interested in fashion careers. If I'd known about my inheritance, if I'd understood my connection to this company, I could have been developing the skills and relationships that would have prepared me to eventually lead the organization my grandmother had built for me. Instead, I'd spent years accepting my family's assertions that creative careers were impractical, that fashion was frivolous, and that I should focus on modest, realistic goals rather than pursuing ambitious dreams. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd stolen my aspirations, convincing me that the very industry I was born to lead was somehow beneath my consideration. As evening approached, I heard my father returning from his office, his voice carrying through the house as he discussed business matters with my mother. They sounded relaxed, successful, completely confident in their ability to maintain the deception that had funded their lifestyle for over a decade. But their comfort was about to be permanently shattered, because tomorrow, the process of reclaiming my inheritance would begin in earnest. I thought about calling Harrison to cancel our dinner plans, but decided that maintaining normal routines was important for keeping my family unsuspicious about my activities. Instead, I would go through the motions of being their grateful, practical daughter for just a little while longer, until Nadia and Fletcher had gathered enough evidence to make my legal position unassailable. The woman who went to dinner that night would be playing a role, pretending to be someone she'd never actually been. But unlike the years of unconscious performance I'd given while believing in my family's version of reality, this would be conscious deception designed to protect my interests while I prepared to reclaim everything that had been stolen from me. Harrison met me at Marina Restaurant, one of Santa Barbara's upscale establishments that catered to exactly the kind of wealthy clientele my family pretended to belong to. He looked handsome in his navy blazer and khakis, every inch the successful young professional who'd been raised to expect good things from life. When he kissed me hello, I wondered how many more times we'd share this kind of easy intimacy, before the truth about my circumstances changed everything between us. Over dinner, he talked enthusiastically about his mother's wedding venue suggestions, cost-saving strategies that would allow us to create something beautiful without straining anyone's budget. His consideration was genuine and well-intentioned, but every word felt like evidence of how completely my family's lies had shaped even the most intimate relationships in my life. "I know money conversations can be awkward," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "But I want you to know that none of that matters to me. We'll figure out how to create the wedding we want, regardless of what our families can contribute." The reassurance was meant to be romantic, but it felt patronizing now that I knew the truth about my actual financial position. I managed to maintain appropriate responses throughout dinner, asking questions about venues and catering options while my mind raced through calculations about what would happen to our relationship once my real circumstances became public. Would Harrison be excited about discovering that his fiancée was actually wealthier than his entire extended family? Or would he feel deceived by the months we'd spent building a relationship based on false assumptions about my identity and potential? After dinner, we walked along the waterfront, Harrison's arm around my shoulders as we discussed timeline and logistics for wedding planning. The conversation felt surreal, like planning an event that might never happen, given how dramatically my life was about to change. But I couldn't explain my growing reservations without revealing what I'd discovered, and I wasn't ready for that conversation until I better understood my legal options. "You seem distracted tonight," Harrison said as we reached my car. "Is everything all right? I know yesterday was a lot to process, with all the family dynamics and financial discussions." His concern was genuine, but it reminded me how much of our relationship had been built around managing the limitations my family had constructed, rather than exploring what we might accomplish together. "I'm just thinking about some family history I learned today," I said carefully. "Sometimes you discover things about your relatives that change how you see your own life." It was truthful, without being specific, a way of acknowledging my emotional state without revealing the source of my distraction. We kissed goodnight, and I drove home through neighborhoods that would soon look very different to me. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming not just my inheritance, but my identity as someone capable of building the kind of life my grandmother had envisioned for me. The woman who'd been grateful for scraps was about to become someone who demanded everything that was rightfully hers. 3 weeks had passed since my discovery, and Fletcher's investigation had uncovered evidence that exceeded even my worst expectations about the scope of my family's deception. The private investigator sat across from me in Nadia's conference room, his weathered face grim as he spread photographs and financial documents across the polished table. What we'd initially suspected was sophisticated theft had revealed itself as a criminal enterprise, spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving dozens of shell companies. "Your father didn't just redirect your inheritance," Fletcher said, pointing to a complex organizational chart that mapped the flow of assets from Belmont Couture empire through various holding companies. "He's been systematically looting the fashion house for over a decade, using your identity and ownership rights to secure loans, sell assets, and divert profits to entities he controls directly." The chart showed a web of financial manipulation that was breathtaking in its complexity and audacity. Vincent Delacroix had created companies in Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands, each designed to obscure the true ownership of Belmont Couture assets while providing him maximum flexibility to extract wealth. He'd sold prime real estate in Manhattan and Paris, liquidated investment portfolios, and even mortgaged the company's flagship showrooms to fund his family's lifestyle and business ventures. "The total amount stolen approaches $800 million, Nadia said, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of outrage that reflected my own feelings. "This isn't just inheritance theft. This is one of the largest cases of trust fraud we've ever documented. Your father has essentially been running a criminal enterprise using your legal identity as cover." Fletcher passed me a folder containing surveillance photographs taken outside Belmont Couture's Beverly Hills headquarters. The images showed my father entering and leaving the building, clearly comfortable with his unauthorized access to facilities that should have been under my control. Other photographs documented meetings with fashion industry executives, business deals being conducted using my stolen authority, and luxury purchases made with profits that belonged to me. "He's been representing himself as your legal guardian and trustee," Fletcher continued. "Even though you turned 25 months ago, triggering the inheritance transfer, he's continued operating as if he has permanent authority over these assets. The fashion house executives believe they're taking orders from your designated representative, not realizing they're participating in an ongoing criminal conspiracy." The implications were staggering. Not only had my father stolen my inheritance, but he'd been actively destroying the company my grandmother had built, selling off irreplaceable assets to fund his immediate desires, rather than preserving the creative legacy she'd intended for me to inherit. Belmont Couture was still profitable, but it was operating as a shadow of what it had been when Francesca died, diminished by years of systematic looting disguised as business management. Nadia opened another folder containing communications intercepts that Fletcher had obtained through legal surveillance methods. The documents revealed conversations between my father and various business associates, discussions that made clear he had no intention of ever transferring control of Belmont Couture to me. Instead, he was actively planning to liquidate additional assets, potentially including the company's intellectual property and trademark rights. "There's a timeline issue we need to address immediately," Nadia said, her tone urgent. "Your father has scheduled a board meeting for next Friday, where he intends to authorize the sale of Belmont Couture's design archives and pattern libraries to a competitor. Once those assets are sold, recovering them will be extremely difficult, if not impossible." The design archives represented the heart of my grandmother's creative legacy, containing decades of original sketches, pattern developments, and innovative techniques that defined Belmont Couture's unique aesthetic. Selling these materials would be like selling the company's soul, reducing a legendary fashion house to just another corporate entity without distinctive identity or creative foundation. "We need to move now," Fletcher said bluntly. "If we wait any longer, there might not be enough left of the company to recover. Your father is accelerating his liquidation timeline, probably because he's planning to disappear the remaining assets before you discover what's happened." The irony was devastating. My father was rushing to complete his theft because he feared I might someday learn the truth about my inheritance, not realizing that I already knew everything and was preparing to stop him. His paranoia about discovery was driving him to destroy the very thing I was fighting to reclaim, creating a race against time that would determine whether Francesca's legacy survived his greed. Nadia spread legal documents across the table, emergency motions and injunction requests that would freeze all Belmont Couture assets and prevent any further sales or transfers. The paperwork was complex, but the basic strategy was straightforward. Prove my rightful ownership, demonstrate the ongoing fraud, and obtain court orders that would immediately halt my father's criminal activities while we pursued full recovery of stolen assets. "The strength of our case is overwhelming," she said confidently. "We have documentary evidence of the original trust terms, proof of fraudulent modifications, financial records showing systematic theft, and surveillance evidence of ongoing criminal activity. No judge will allow this to continue once they understand what's been happening." But she also warned that my family would fight back viciously once they realized their deception had been discovered. They would probably claim I was mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, or somehow unfit to control such valuable assets. They might argue that they'd been protecting my interests rather than stealing from me, or that the trust modifications had been legitimate attempts to preserve wealth rather than fraudulent schemes designed to enrich themselves. "You need to be prepared for character assassination," Fletcher added grimly. "Rich families don't give up hundreds of millions of dollars without getting ugly. They'll dig up every embarrassing moment from your past, question your motives for pursuing this case, and try to make you seem like an ungrateful daughter destroying your family for money." The warning was sobering but not surprising. I'd lived with my family's emotional manipulation my entire life, understanding how skillfully they could reframe reality to serve their purposes. But this time, I had documentation, legal representation, and the moral certainty that came from knowing I was fighting to reclaim what had been stolen, rather than pursuing something I didn't deserve. We spent the rest of the morning preparing emergency legal filings, drafting press statements that would control the narrative once our case became public, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies that would investigate the criminal aspects of my father's activities. The process felt surreal, transforming family dynamics I'd accepted as normal into federal crimes that could result in lengthy prison sentences. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Nadia said as our meeting concluded. "Your engagement. Harrison and his family are going to be blindsided when this story breaks. You might want to consider having that conversation before they read about it in the newspapers." The reminder hit me like cold water. For 3 weeks, I'd been living a double life, maintaining my relationship with Harrison while secretly preparing to expose my family's crimes. He still believed he was engaged to a woman who needed his financial support, planning a modest wedding that would accommodate our limited resources. Discovering that his fiancée was actually the victim of one of the largest inheritance thefts in California history would fundamentally change everything between us. I drove home through afternoon traffic, my mind racing through potential conversations with Harrison while simultaneously processing the magnitude of what would happen once we filed our legal motions. By tomorrow evening, my family's carefully constructed world would be in ruins, their stolen lifestyle exposed as criminal enterprise, their social standing destroyed by public revelation of systematic fraud and theft. The house was quiet when I arrived, my parents probably still at their respective offices, continuing their daily routines without any awareness that their crimes had been discovered and documented. I walked through rooms filled with furniture and artwork purchased with my stolen inheritance, seeing everything with the clarity that came from understanding exactly how each luxury had been funded. In my room, I called Harrison and asked him to meet me for coffee that evening. My voice must have carried something unusual, because he immediately asked if everything was all right, whether I needed him to come over sooner, if there was some emergency he should know about. His concern was genuine and touching, a reminder of why I'd fallen for him in the first place, but also evidence of how much our relationship would change once he learned the truth about my circumstances. "I just need to talk to you about some family developments," I said carefully. Nothing dangerous, but definitely important. The understatement felt necessary to prevent him from panicking, but it also highlighted how inadequate normal language was for describing the magnitude of what I'd discovered about my life and identity. Before leaving to meet Harrison, I called Simone Belmont, the current CEO of Belmont Couture Empire, using contact information Fletcher had provided. She was the executive my father had been deceiving, the woman who believed she was taking legitimate orders from my appointed representative rather than participating in criminal fraud. Nadia had advised me to establish direct contact before our legal filings became public, both to verify our intelligence and to begin asserting my rightful authority over the company. "Ms. Belmont," I said when her assistant transferred my call, "this is Zara Delacroix. I believe you've been working with my father regarding Belmont Couture business matters." The silence that followed my introduction was telling, suggesting that she hadn't expected to hear from me directly and wasn't sure how to respond. "Ms. Delacroix," she said finally, her voice carefully professional but carrying undertones of confusion. "Yes, I've been coordinating with your father on various operational decisions. Is there something specific you needed to discuss?" Her tone suggested that she'd been told I was either unavailable or uninterested in company management, probably as part of my father's strategy to maintain exclusive control. "Actually, there are some legal issues regarding my father's authority that will be resolved very soon," I said, choosing my words carefully to avoid triggering any defensive responses. "I wanted you to know that I'll be taking a much more active role in company oversight going forward." The statement was diplomatic but clear, establishing my intention to assert control without directly accusing anyone of wrongdoing. "I see," she replied, though her tone suggested she didn't see at all. "Perhaps we should schedule a meeting to discuss the transition of responsibilities. Your father has been very hands-on with strategic decisions, so any changes in management structure would need to be carefully coordinated." Her response confirmed that Vincent had been deeply involved in operational decisions, using stolen authority to make choices that should have been mine. We agreed to meet the following week after my legal situation had been clarified through court filings. Simone seemed relieved to postpone detailed discussions, probably sensing that family dynamics were more complicated than she'd been led to believe. Her willingness to accommodate my request suggested that she'd be cooperative once she understood the true legal situation, which would be crucial for maintaining company stability during the transition period. Harrison was waiting at Corner Coffee when I arrived, looking concerned but trying to hide his anxiety behind normal conversation about work and weekend plans. We ordered drinks and found a quiet corner where we could talk without being overheard, though the privacy felt ironic given that our conversation would probably be public knowledge within days. "You sounded serious on the phone," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "What's going on with your family? Is someone sick? Do you need help with something?" His immediate assumption that I might need support reflected the dynamic that had defined our entire relationship, his role as provider and protector for someone who supposedly lacked resources and options. "Harrison, I need to tell you something that's going to sound incredible," I began, then paused to gather my thoughts. How do you explain to your fiancé that everything he knows about your life has been an elaborate lie? How do you reveal that the modest circumstances that attracted him to your practical nature were actually the result of systematic theft and emotional abuse? I started with my grandmother Francesca, explaining how my family had described her as a woman who died in modest circumstances, leaving behind only sentimental items and minor debts. Then I told him what I'd actually discovered, that Francesca had been one of the most successful fashion entrepreneurs of her generation, building an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars that she'd intended for me to inherit. Harrison's expression shifted from concern to confusion to complete disbelief as I described the documents I'd found in my father's study, the evidence of systematic theft and fraud, and the legal investigation that had revealed the full scope of my family's deception. He asked clarifying questions, trying to understand how such massive fraud could have remained hidden for over a decade, but mostly he just listened with the stunned attention of someone processing information that challenged everything he thought he knew. "So you're saying," he said slowly, "that your family has been stealing from you your entire adult life, and you're actually the owner of a fashion empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars?" The summary sounded even more incredible when spoken aloud, like the plot of a movie rather than the reality of someone he'd been planning to marry. "That's exactly what I'm saying," I confirmed. "And tomorrow we're filing legal motions that will freeze all company assets and begin criminal prosecution of my father for trust fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The timeline suddenly made our conversation feel urgent, a last moment of privacy before everything became public knowledge and media sensation. Harrison sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair as he processed the implications of what I'd told him. His confusion was understandable, but I also detected something else in his expression, a calculation that suggested he was trying to figure out how this revelation would affect his own life and prospects. "This is going to be huge news," he said finally. Quote, "Your family is well known in business circles, and if what you're saying is true, this will be one of the biggest financial scandals in California history." His focus on the public relations aspects, rather than the emotional impact on me, felt revealing, suggesting that he was already thinking about how my situation would reflect on his own reputation and career. "It's definitely going to be public," I agreed. "Which is why I wanted you to hear this from me before it becomes a media story. I realize this changes everything about our relationship, about the assumptions we've both been making about our future together." The acknowledgement felt necessary, giving him permission to process honestly, rather than pretending that such massive revelations wouldn't affect our dynamic. "Changes everything how?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already understood some of the implications. "I mean, obviously it's shocking that your family has been lying to you, and I can't imagine how betrayed you must feel. But why would that change anything between us?" His question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about what our relationship had been built on. Harrison had been attracted to my modesty, my practical approach to money, my apparent gratitude for his financial security and social connections. He'd enjoyed being the provider, the one with superior resources and opportunities. Learning that I was actually wealthier than his entire extended family combined would necessarily reshape those dynamics in ways that might not be comfortable for either of us. "Harrison, you fell in love with someone who needed your help," I said gently. "Someone whose family couldn't afford proper wedding venues, who shopped at thrift stores, who was grateful for your financial stability. That person never actually existed. I'm the heir to a fashion empire, and once this legal case is resolved, I'll have resources and opportunities that neither of us has ever imagined." The conversation continued for another hour, Harrison asking questions about timeline and legal strategy while I tried to help him understand how completely my circumstances were about to change. He was supportive and concerned, but I could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd proposed to with the heiress I was about to become. The modest, practical fiancé who'd appreciated his family's social connections was being replaced by someone who could buy and sell most of their circle without financial strain. "I need some time to process this," he said finally, and I could hear the emotional distance that was already growing between us. "It's not that I don't support you pursuing justice, but this is a lot to absorb. Everything we've planned, everything we've discussed about our future, it was all based on circumstances that weren't real." I understood his confusion and didn't push for immediate decisions about our relationship. The next few months would be chaotic as the legal case proceeded, and my true identity became public knowledge. Neither of us could predict how we'd feel about each other once the dust settled, and we understood who we actually were outside the false narrative that had brought us together. That night, I lay awake thinking about the transformation that would begin the next morning. For 25 years, I'd been Zara Delacroix, the grateful daughter who accepted whatever circumstances her family provided. Tomorrow, I would begin becoming someone else entirely, the rightful heir to Francesca's legacy, a woman with the resources and authority to build whatever life she chose for herself. The woman who went to sleep that night was saying goodbye to an identity that had never been real, preparing to step into a future that would be entirely of her own making. My family had stolen my inheritance and my understanding of what was possible for my life, but they hadn't destroyed my capacity to reclaim both. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin, and I was finally ready to stop being their victim and start being Francesca's granddaughter. Early the next morning, Nadia called to confirm that all our legal filings had been submitted, and that court orders freezing Belmont Couture assets would be issued within hours. Media outlets had been notified about the case, and she expected the story to break by midday. My family would learn about the legal action through formal service of process, probably while they were at their respective offices, surrounded by colleagues and business associates who would witness their shock and humiliation. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, and I could hear both excitement and concern in her voice. We were about to embark on a legal battle that would be closely watched by business media, fashion industry observers, and anyone interested in stories about wealthy families destroying themselves through greed and deception. "I've been ready my entire life," I said, and realized I was telling the truth. Every lecture about being practical, every reminder about my position in the family, every suggestion that I should be grateful for scraps, had been preparing me for this moment when I would stop accepting their narrative and start demanding everything that was rightfully mine. The phone rang again almost immediately. Fletcher's voice was tense but satisfied as he reported that federal agents were executing search warrants at Delacroix Properties and several related businesses, seizing computers and financial records that would provide additional evidence of my father's criminal activities. The investigation had expanded beyond civil recovery to include potential charges for money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. "Your father is about to have a very bad day," Fletcher said with grim satisfaction, "and it's going to get much worse before this is over." The vindication I felt was mixed with sadness about what my family had chosen to do with their lives, but mostly I felt relief that the truth was finally coming to light after years of systematic deception and theft. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blazer and tailored pants that made me look serious and professional rather than modest and grateful. Today, I would need to project authority and competence. As media outlets contacted me for statements about the case, and fashion industry executives reached out to understand what my legal victory would mean for Belmont Couture's future operations. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone I'd never been allowed to become, Francesca Delacroix's granddaughter, preparing to reclaim her inheritance and honor her legacy. The transformation felt both terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping into a life that had been waiting for me to be brave enough to claim it. Today, the real Zara Delacroix would finally emerge from the shadow of her family's lies and deception. The news broke at exactly 11:47 in the morning. I was sitting in Nadia's office when her assistant rushed in with printouts from major business publications, their headlines stark and unforgiving. "Heiress accuses family of stealing fashion empire," read the Wall Street Journal. "Belmont Couture founder's granddaughter claims massive inheritance fraud," announced Forbes. "California real estate mogul charged with trust fund theft exceeding $800 million, blazed across the Financial Times. My phone began vibrating incessantly as reporters, distant relatives, and former classmates discovered my story through social media and news alerts. Each notification felt like validation, proof that the truth I'd uncovered was significant enough to capture public attention and force accountability from people who'd operated in shadow for over a decade. Nadia monitored multiple news feeds while fielding calls from journalists seeking official statements and industry analysts trying to understand what my case meant for Belmont Couture's future operations. The story was spreading faster than either of us had anticipated, generating the kind of sustained media attention that would make it impossible for my family to dismiss or minimize what they'd done. "Your father's attorney just called," she said, hanging up from a brief but heated conversation. They want to discuss settlement terms immediately, before this gets any bigger. The desperation in their request was telling, suggesting that Vincent understood exactly how much evidence we possessed and how devastating public exposure would be to his reputation and freedom. "What kind of settlement?" I asked, though I suspected his proposal would be designed to minimize criminal liability rather than provide full restitution for what he'd stolen. Men like my father rarely accepted responsibility for their actions, preferring to negotiate reduced consequences rather than face complete accountability. Full asset transfer, criminal immunity, and a confidentiality agreement that would prevent you from discussing the case publicly. Nadia replied with obvious disdain. Essentially, he wants to give back what he stole in exchange for avoiding prison and keeping the whole thing quiet. The offer revealed his priorities clearly. Protecting his reputation and freedom mattered more than acknowledging the harm he'd caused or accepting appropriate consequences for his crimes. I didn't need time to consider his proposal. 13 years of systematic theft, emotional manipulation, and identity destruction couldn't be resolved through quiet settlements designed to protect his comfort. My grandmother's legacy deserved better than backroom deals that prioritized his convenience over justice and accountability. "Tell him no," I said firmly. He had 13 years to do the right thing voluntarily. Now he gets to face the full consequences of what he chose to do instead. Nadia smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd hoped for exactly that response, then returned to her calls with reporters and law enforcement agencies. Fletcher arrived an hour later with updates from the federal investigation that had been proceeding parallel to our civil case. His expression was grimmer than usual as he spread surveillance photographs across the conference table, images that documented my father's increasingly desperate attempts to liquidate remaining assets before court orders could prevent further theft. He spent yesterday trying to arrange emergency sales of artwork, jewelry, and vintage wine collections, Fletcher reported. Most legitimate dealers refused to participate once they learned about the legal situation, but he managed to move some items through private collectors who don't ask many questions. The revelation that Vincent was still actively stealing even after discovering our investigation demonstrated either remarkable arrogance or complete panic about his legal exposure. The good news is that federal agents intercepted most of the transactions and recovered the items, Fletcher continued. But it shows he's not planning to cooperate voluntarily. He's going to fight this until the very end, probably hoping he can outlast your resources or find some technical loophole that invalidates your claims. The surveillance photos showed my father looking haggard and stressed, a dramatic contrast to the confident businessman who'd lectured me about fiscal responsibility while living off my stolen inheritance. His expensive suits couldn't hide the desperation in his posture as he moved between meetings with lawyers, accountants, and business associates, who were probably advising him about asset protection strategies and jurisdiction shopping. "What about my mother and Bianca?" I asked, realizing I hadn't seen any updates about how the rest of my family was responding to the public exposure of their crimes. Fletcher's expression darkened further as he pulled out another folder containing information that would prove even more disturbing than my father's continued theft attempts. "Your mother has been busy," he said grimly. "She's been calling everyone in your social circle, telling them you've had some kind of mental breakdown, and are making false accusations because you're jealous of Bianca's success." The strategy was predictable, but still painful. Another example of how my family preferred character assassination to honest accountability when faced with consequences for their actions. "She's specifically targeting Harrison's family," Fletcher continued, "trying to convince them that you're emotionally unstable and possibly dangerous. She's suggesting that your engagement should be called off for Harrison's protection, and that anyone who supports your legal case is enabling your supposed delusions." The cruelty was breathtaking but not surprising. Faced with evidence of systematic criminal activity, my mother had chosen to attack my credibility and mental health rather than acknowledge what her family had done. She was trying to isolate me from potential support networks while positioning herself and Vincent as concerned relatives dealing with a disturbed family member. "Bianca's approach has been different," Fletcher added. "She's been posting on social media about family loyalty and the importance of not believing everything you read in the news." She's not directly denying the allegations, but she's implying that there are two sides to every story and that family disputes should be resolved privately. The contrast in their strategies revealed interesting insights about how they viewed their legal exposure. My mother was going for complete denial and character assassination, probably because she felt personally vulnerable to criminal charges. Bianca was taking a more diplomatic approach, possibly because she'd been less directly involved in the financial fraud, or because she thought public sympathy might protect her from serious consequences. Nadia returned from her latest round of media calls with updates that would reshape public understanding of the case and my family's place in California society. Major fashion publications were preparing in-depth profiles of my grandmother Francesca, exploring her innovations and business accomplishments that had been deliberately erased from public memory. Industry experts were analyzing what Belmont Couture's future might look like under my leadership, speculating about potential expansions and creative directions. The story is evolving beyond simple inheritance theft, she explained. People are starting to understand that this is about creative legacy, artistic innovation, and what happens when business families prioritize greed over cultural contribution. The broader narrative was more compelling than simple financial crime, touching on themes that resonated with anyone who'd ever felt their talents dismissed or their potential limited by family expectations. There's something else, Nadia continued, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard before. Simone Belmont called this morning. She wants to arrange an emergency board meeting so you can formally assume control of company operations. Apparently, several major clients have been calling to express support for your legal action and concern about continued uncertainty regarding company leadership. The news felt surreal. For weeks, I'd been focused on proving my ownership rights and stopping my father's theft. The possibility that I might actually step into operational control of Belmont Couture Empire had seemed like a distant outcome, something that would happen eventually if our legal strategies succeeded. But the fashion industry's immediate acceptance of my claims and eagerness to work with me suggested that the transition might happen much faster than anyone had anticipated. What would that involve? I asked, trying to imagine myself walking into boardrooms and design studios where I'd be expected to make decisions affecting thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars in business operations. The responsibility felt enormous, but also exhilarating in ways I'd never allowed myself to imagine. Initially, just establishing your legal authority and meeting key executives, Nadia replied, but ultimately you'd be deciding the company's strategic direction, approving major design initiatives, and basically becoming the creative and business leader your grandmother intended you to be. The description matched dreams I'd harbored secretly for years, career aspirations I'd never believed were possible given my family's insistence that such ambitions were unrealistic. We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for what would essentially be my debut as a fashion industry executive, reviewing company organizational charts, financial reports, and strategic planning documents that would help me understand Belmont Couture's current operations and future opportunities. The learning curve was steep, but I felt energized rather than overwhelmed by the challenge of mastering complex business and creative decisions. My phone buzzed with a text from Harrison asking if we could meet that evening to discuss how my legal case would affect our wedding plans. His tone was carefully neutral, but I detected underlying tension that suggested he was struggling to process the magnitude of changes in my circumstances and social position. The conversation we'd avoided for weeks was finally becoming unavoidable. I agreed to meet him at Harborview Restaurant, one of Santa Barbara's most exclusive establishments that I'd never been able to afford before learning about my inheritance. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now wealthy enough to buy the entire restaurant while my fiancé was still calculating whether he could afford the wine list. Harrison was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, looking handsome but troubled in his navy blazer and crisp white shirt. He stood to greet me with a hug that felt formal rather than intimate, suggesting that emotional distance had been growing during the days since I'd revealed the truth about my inheritance and family situation. "You look different," he said as we settled into our seats. "More confident, maybe. Or just less worried about things." His observation was accurate, but also revealing, highlighting how much of our relationship had been built around his role as protector and provider for someone who supposedly needed his support and guidance. "I feel different," I admitted, finding out who I really am, understanding what's possible for my future. It changes how you see everything. The transformation was deeper than simple financial security, involving a fundamental shift in how I understood my own capabilities and potential. We ordered dinner and made polite conversation about the media coverage and public reaction to my case, but the underlying tension was obvious to both of us. Harrison was processing the reality that his modest, practical fiancée was actually one of the wealthiest women in California, heir to a fashion empire that generated more revenue than most Fortune 500 companies. "I've been thinking about us," he said finally, his voice carrying the careful tone people use when delivering difficult news. "About what this means for our relationship and our plans for the future." The preamble suggested he'd reached conclusions that wouldn't be comfortable for either of us to discuss. "And what have you decided?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. The dynamic that had brought us together no longer existed, and neither of us was sure what kind of relationship might be possible without the foundation of his superior resources and my grateful dependence. "I fell in love with someone who needed me," he said honestly. "Someone whose circumstances made my support meaningful and important. But you don't need me anymore, do you? You can afford anything you want, go anywhere you choose, build whatever life appeals to you. What role would I play in that kind of future?" His question revealed insecurities I hadn't fully considered, but probably should have anticipated. Harrison's identity was built around being successful, stable, and generous with people who appreciated his advantages. Dating an heiress to a fashion empire would require him to accept a supporting role rather than starring in our relationship, and that adjustment might be more challenging than either of us had realized. "I still care about you," I said carefully, "but you're right that everything has changed. I'm not the same person who got engaged to you 6 months ago, because that person was created by lies and limitations that never actually existed." The acknowledgement felt necessary, but also sad. Recognizing that our relationship had been built on false foundations that couldn't support the truth about who I actually was. We talked for another hour, both of us trying to find ways to preserve what we'd built together, while acknowledging that the circumstances that had created our connection no longer applied. Harrison was supportive of my legal case and excited about my opportunities with Belmont Couture, but he was also honest about feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of changes in my social and financial position. "Maybe we should postpone the wedding," he suggested finally. "Give ourselves time to figure out who we are now, what kind of relationship makes sense given everything that's happened." The proposal was diplomatic but clear, acknowledging that our engagement had been based on assumptions that were no longer valid. I agreed that postponement made sense, though we both understood that delaying our wedding was probably the first step toward ending our relationship entirely. The man who'd been attracted to my modesty and practicality was struggling to envision a future with someone who owned a multinational fashion empire and would soon be making decisions that affected thousands of people. We parted with genuine affection, but also with the understanding that our paths were diverging in ways that might not be reconcilable. Harrison would probably find happiness with someone who needed his stability and appreciated his conventional success. I would build a different kind of life, one that honored my grandmother's legacy and explored possibilities I'd never been allowed to imagine. The next morning brought news that would accelerate my transition into my new identity faster than anyone had anticipated. Nadia called before 7 to report that federal prosecutors had arrested my father at his office, charging him with multiple felonies including trust fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The dramatic timing was intended to maximize media coverage and demonstrate that wealthy criminals wouldn't receive preferential treatment. The arrest was coordinated with civil court orders, transferring immediate control of all Belmont Couture assets to you, she explained. "Effective immediately, you are the legal owner and operational authority for the entire empire." The news felt surreal, transforming me overnight from theft victim to fashion industry executive, with responsibilities affecting thousands of employees and hundreds of millions in business operations. "There's a car waiting outside to take you to Beverly Hills," Nadia continued. "Simone Belmont is calling an emergency board meeting for this afternoon, and the entire executive team wants to meet their new owner." The timeline was accelerated beyond anything we'd planned, but the fashion industry's eagerness to work with me suggested that my transition into leadership would be smoother than expected. I dressed in my most professional outfit, a black suit that I'd purchased for job interviews, but that now seemed appropriate for my first day as a fashion empire executive. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone I'd never been allowed to become, Francesca Delacroix's granddaughter, prepared to honor her legacy and build upon her innovations. The drive to Beverly Hills felt like traveling through a new world, one where I belonged in the luxury cars and exclusive neighborhoods that had always seemed foreign to my circumstances. The Belmont Couture headquarters was a stunning building of glass and steel, its lobby filled with photographs celebrating decades of innovative designs and fashion industry achievements. Simone Belmont met me in the executive suite, her expression combining professional excitement with obvious relief about finally meeting the rightful owner she'd been waiting to serve. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with the kind of sophisticated style that reflected deep understanding of fashion and business leadership. "Ms. Delacroix," she said, extending her hand with genuine warmth, "I cannot tell you how honored we are to finally welcome you home to Belmont Couture. Your grandmother would be so proud to see you here." Her words carried emotional weight that caught me off guard, acknowledging not just my business ownership but my personal connection to the creative legacy Francesca had built. The board meeting was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, surrounding me with fashion industry executives, creative directors, and business strategists who treated my opinions and decisions with respect I'd never received in my own family. They briefed me on current operations, upcoming collections, and strategic opportunities that would allow Belmont Couture to expand its influence and market position. "We've been waiting for leadership that understands both the creative and business aspects of what we do," explained Marcus Chen, the creative director who'd worked with my grandmother during her final years. "Vincent never really grasped the artistic vision, but you have Francesca's eyes. I can see it in how you look at the designs, how you respond to the creative possibilities." His observation touched something deep in my identity, connecting me to talents and interests that my family had dismissed as impractical, but that were actually central to my inherited legacy. For the first time in my life, my creative instincts were being recognized as valuable assets rather than frivolous distractions from more serious pursuits. Over the following hours, I toured design studios, manufacturing facilities, and retail showrooms that represented the scope of what my grandmother had built and what I would now be responsible for protecting and expanding. Each space felt like discovering pieces of myself that had been hidden or denied. Creative environments where I could finally explore possibilities that had been systematically discouraged. The day concluded with a press conference where I made my first public statement as the owner of Belmont Couture Empire. Standing before fashion reporters and industry analysts, I spoke about honoring my grandmother's legacy, while building upon her innovations to create even greater artistic and commercial success. Francesca Delacroix believed that fashion should inspire people to see themselves more beautifully, I said, reading from notes I'd prepared with Simone's guidance. Under my leadership, Belmont Couture will continue pursuing that vision while exploring new ways to connect creativity with social responsibility and sustainable business practices. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with industry publications describing my debut as promising evidence that Belmont Couture would thrive under my direction. Fashion influencers and celebrity clients expressed excitement about working with someone who combined inherited creative legacy with fresh perspectives on design and business strategy. That evening, I returned to my family's house for what I knew would be my final night in the home, where I'd been raised to accept limitations that never actually existed. My mother was waiting in the living room, her usual elegant composure replaced by obvious anxiety about her legal exposure and social humiliation. "Zara," she said, her voice carrying a pleading tone I'd never heard before, "we need to talk about this situation. There are things you don't understand, family considerations, that make this more complicated than it appears." Her attempt to reframe systematic theft as family complexity was predictable but still disappointing. Evidence that she preferred manipulation to honest accountability, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. "I understand everything perfectly," I replied, setting down my purse with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to justify her decisions to people who'd spent years lying to her. "You stole my inheritance, convinced me I should be grateful for scraps from my own table, and tried to destroy any evidence of grandmother's actual legacy. The only thing I don't understand is how you thought you could maintain that deception forever." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, my mother alternating between attempts to minimize what they'd done and desperate appeals for family loyalty that she'd never shown me during years of systematic emotional abuse. She seemed genuinely shocked that I wasn't willing to forgive and forget, as if stealing hundreds of millions of dollars was the kind of family disagreement that could be resolved through holiday dinners and shared memories. "Where will you go now?" she asked finally, apparently accepting that I wouldn't be moved by her manipulation tactics. The question revealed how completely she'd misunderstood the magnitude of what I'd reclaimed, still thinking in terms of modest accommodations rather than the vast resources now at my disposal. "I'm buying a house in Beverly Hills," I said simply. Something appropriate for someone who owns a fashion empire. The statement wasn't meant to be cruel, but it highlighted the distance that now separated my circumstances from hers, the reversal of power dynamics that would define any future relationship between us. I packed my belongings that night, filling suitcases with clothes that mostly came from thrift stores and discount retailers, items that represented the modest lifestyle my family had constructed around their theft of my actual resources. Tomorrow, I would begin shopping for a wardrobe appropriate to my real social and professional position, clothing that reflected my identity as heir to one of fashion's most innovative legacies. The woman who left that house the next morning was not the same person who'd discovered the truth about her inheritance just weeks earlier. That woman had been defined by limitations and grateful acceptance of whatever circumstances her family provided. The woman I'd become understood her own power and potential, ready to honor her grandmother's legacy while building something even greater for future generations. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated design studio at Belmont Couture headquarters, reviewing sketches for our upcoming collection with Marcus and the creative team I'd assembled from fashion's most innovative talents. The company had exceeded every financial projection since I'd assumed control, driven by renewed creative energy and strategic partnerships that my grandmother would have admired. My father was serving a 15-year federal sentence for trust fraud and money laundering, his business empire dismantled, and assets forfeited to compensate victims of his various schemes. My mother had pled guilty to lesser charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations, though she remained bitter about what she called my betrayal of family loyalty. Bianca had moved to Europe, distancing herself from the scandal while building a modest career that relied on her own efforts rather than stolen resources. Harrison had become engaged to someone more appropriate to his actual social position, a relationship that would probably provide the comfortable predictability he'd always preferred. We occasionally exchanged polite messages through social media, but we both understood that the people we'd become couldn't recreate what we'd shared when we were different individuals with different circumstances. The transformation from grateful daughter to fashion empire owner had required rebuilding every aspect of my identity, learning to trust my own judgment rather than accepting others' definitions of my worth and potential. But standing in my grandmother's studio, surrounded by designs that would influence how people around the world saw themselves and their possibilities, I understood that reclaiming my inheritance had given me much more than financial security. It had given me the chance to become who I was always meant to be, before my family's lies convinced me to accept something smaller and sadder than my grandmother had envisioned for her legacy. The woman who owned Belmont Couture Empire wasn't just wealthy. She was creative, powerful, and committed to building something beautiful that would outlast her lifetime, just as Francesca had done decades earlier. Looking out the window at the Los Angeles skyline, I thought about the girl who'd worn thrift store dresses to her own engagement party, accepting humiliation because she'd been taught that asking for better was selfish and ungrateful. That girl had deserved so much more than she'd been given, but she'd also possessed the strength to fight for what belonged to her once she understood what had been stolen. Now, surrounded by the empire my grandmother had built and I had reclaimed, I was finally home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.